On the simplest level, the stunning colors of autumn are a wonderful reminder of the diversity and creativity built into God's creation. In the spring and summer, we sometimes can't see the trees because of the forest. There's a sameness and uniformity in the green growth, and that disappears entirely once fall arrives. Only then do we see just how unique each tree really is. No two are exactly alike, and we revel in the awesome artistry of autumn. But that should remind us that each of us is a unique creation too. The church is like a forest in which God brings together a variety of people with different strengths, gifts, and possibilities. We're interconnected and interdependent, just like trees in the woods, and our shared purpose is to glorify God and serve others. In that regard, we're like trees. But in John 12, Jesus compares us to the branches of a grapevine or a fruit tree. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit, he says, referring to the good and godly things he can bring to our lives. But if you do not remain in me, you're like a branch that's thrown away. Yet it is to my Father's glory when you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my followers. Now, remain in my love by keeping my commands. Love each other as I have loved you. Diversity, unity, and responsibility. But on a deeper level, autumn holds another message. When the leaves change in the fall, they're actually showing their true colors, and that's a metaphor for us. It all begins with photosynthesis, which in plain English means putting together with light. All trees survive by putting together water and carbon dioxide with sunlight. Water is drawn by a tree's roots, carbon dioxide is absorbed through tiny holes in its leaves and branches, and sunlight is absorbed in the leaves by a bright green chemical called chlorophyll. That chlorophyll absorbs red and blue light, which is why it looks green. Once the sunlight reacts with water and CO2, it makes sugars or glucose, which is plant food. Essentially, leaves are the food factories of every tree. While chlorophyll does its job, it fills the leaves and turns them green, overwhelming the tree's natural pigments like yellow and orange carotenes, which are also responsible for the color of corn and carrots. Spiritual photosynthesis works in exactly the same way. The Bible describes Jesus as the light, and we need to put together with light the two essentials of love and faith. The Apostle Paul says, I pray that from his glorious, unlimited resources, God will empower you with inner strength through his Spirit. Then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust in him. Your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong. Then you'll be complete with all the fullness of life and power that comes from God. That's what spirituality is all about, having the fullness of life and the power that comes from God. When we truly experience God's love in a way that goes beyond theory and theology, we can learn to trust him, and that's the essence of faith. Jesus plus love plus trust equals a life of completeness and power. But that can only happen when we're powered by the inner strength that comes from the Holy Spirit. So think of him as chlorophyll. When we allow God to create in our hearts the sustenance we need, he fills our lives with the life-giving green of his goodness. Our inclination to sin is still there, but it's forced into the background by his influence over us. The problem is, our human nature doesn't stay in the background. And like plants and trees, our spirituality has seasons too. And to see how that works, all we have to do is look at what happens in nature. In the fall, cooler temperatures and less daylight signal the leaves to stop making food. The chlorophyll breaks down, the green color fades, and the natural pigments reemerge and dominate. orange in maples, deep brown in oaks, and reds in sumacs and dogwoods. At the spot where the leaf is attached to the branch, a special layer of cells develops and gradually weakens the tissues that hold the leaf in place. When the leaf is blown off or falls from its own weight, the tree seals the spot, stopping sugars and food from leaving the tree. A leaf scar is left behind, and once a tree is leafless, it can't make food, so it rests. Essentially, the tree sleeps until the water in its roots starts moving again in the spring. Then it puts out new leaves to start making more food. And since trees in the fall always reabsorb chlorophyll molecules, they can still use those molecules each spring to produce more chlorophyll without having to start from scratch. In the same way, life is about seasons and constant renewal. There will always be periods when our faith and our hearts grow colder, when we're less exposed to the light, and when we stop getting the nourishment we need. And the fastest way to weaken is to stop praying, stop reading our Bibles, and not go to worship on a regular basis. When we spend less time with God and more time with people who care nothing about Him, our loyalty and allegiance start to turn. And then our true colors come out. Only in our case, it isn't pretty. Before long, we no longer draw on God's love. Instead, we withdraw our trust in Him, trying to rely on ourselves. Gradually, a layer of sin and insensitivity begins to weaken the bond that holds us in place, and we just let go, especially when the winds of adversity are at work. And no matter how high a tree gets, its leaves still fall as low as the others go. Oh, the process may seem dazzling for a while. Sin has always been pleasing to the eye. But when tempted to see our independence from God as a beautiful thing, we should remember the vivid colors of autumn are a sign of coming death. And so it is with our spiritual fall. At the very least, letting go of God throws us into spiritual dormancy. The Apostle John knew that and says, "Don't love this world or what it offers. For when you love the world, you don't have God's love. For the world offers only a craving for physical pleasure, a hunger for everything we see, and pride in our achievements and possessions. But this world is fading away, along with everything people crave. But those who do what pleases God will live forever." Thanks to His grace and forgiveness, the potential for renewal is always there, because even when we let go, nothing can separate us from the love of God, as Paul says in Romans 8, verse 38. And from that scar left where we last relinquished our love and trust, new growth can eventually emerge. We can always turn back to God, and it's not as though we have to start from scratch. Failure doesn't mean that all the gains we made in the past are gone for good. Instead, God uses our failure so that we can make gains for good. And remember, it's not just the leaves that fall in the fall. Among other things, acorns and chestnuts also drop to the ground. They provide a much-needed supply for animals preparing for a long, hard winter when food will be hard to come by. It's all part of the cycle of life. Not only do the tree nuts sustain a variety of creatures, they're also the key to renewal. As the saying goes, from a tiny acorn grows the mighty oak. It's much the same as the kernel of wheat Jesus talked about. As He was facing His own death, He said, "Unless a kernel of wheat is planted in the soil and dies, it remains alone. But its death will produce many new kernels, a plentiful harvest of new lives. Those who love their life in this world will lose it. Those who care nothing for their life here will keep it for eternity. My Father will honor anyone who serves me." Just as the death and resurrection of Jesus brought us new life, the death of our old self is a powerful way of encouraging other people. Even our worst failure can point to the love and mercy of God, help us find common ground with others who are struggling, and build into our relationships a new level of trust and transparency. Our willingness to be open and authentic is a powerful way to draw people to the church. And don't forget, the falling leaves are just part of the story. They set the stage for renewal and new life in the spring. That's why leaves have been a symbol of immortality in many cultures. They remind us that death is a natural part of life. We flourish, we fade, and we fall. But after a season, we flourish again. In essence, that's the entire story of the Bible. It opens with the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Only in Genesis, it's the humans who fall, not the leaves. And then God brings us together again as one through the death of his Son on a cross made from a tree. And at the end of the story, there's this poetic vision of heaven. In Revelation 22, we read that, like Eden, heaven will have two trees, only this time both are the tree of life. And instead of dropping their leaves, they will bear 12 crops of fruit, one a month, a sign of God's power, protection, and provision. John says of those trees, their leaves will be used to heal the nations, and we will see the very face of God. Until then, we move through the seasons of our spiritual journey, filled with the chlorophyll of faith, but still prone to let our true colors shine through when we spend less time in the light. But even then, there's a strange beauty in the balance because it reveals our dependency on God and one another and creates the conditions for renewed joy and rejuvenation. Even when fall gives way to the winter of the soul, things are dormant but not dead, just waiting for a return to the light to get the living water moving again. Then comes a whole new cycle of growth and spiritual green. So don't be discouraged. Just look around and you'll see that we're all in this together, and we can't afford to turn our backs on God and the help He promises, including the help we get from each other, because pride really does go before your fall.